Hi, and welcome to this mini lesson on the anatomy of the teleost skull. Today I'm going to draw the major skull components here on the lightboard so that you can understand how the major pieces fit together. I'll be working primarily with big functional units, which in most cases are made up of multiple bones. I'm primarily interested in having you understand how big groups of bones come together to form the skull, which will in turn help you understand how those components evolved and how they function to help fishes to capture food, sense their environment, and respire. Let me start by orienting you. The left side of the screen is going to be the anterior of my fish head, and the right side will be posterior. Dorsal is the top of the screen, and ventral the bottom. Now I'm going to start by drawing this large blue box, which represents the neurocranium, or brain case of the fish. So the neurocranium functions unsurprisingly to house and protect the brain of the fish, but it also houses and protects many of a fish's sensory organs. The three most obvious of these, the nose, the eye, and the ear, fit into three cavities or capsules on each side of the neurocranium. So let me go ahead and add those. So we refer to these cavities collectively as sensory capsules. The anterior sensory capsule houses the nose of the fish, and these are called the nasal capsules. As we'll see in more detail later in the course, there's a whorl of folded tissue inside each one that provides lots of surface area to enable the fish's sense of smell, or chemical reception. Now, in the middle of each side of the neurocranium, you'll find large cavities called the optic capsules. These house the eyes. And posteriorly, you'll find the ears of the fish inside the left and right otic capsules. These are probably the least obvious of the capsules because they are encased entirely within the neurocranium without an obvious opening to the outside. But despite the fact that you can't easily see them, fishes really do have ears, and if you cut the neurocranium open, you can find them. The otic capsules also house the fish's otoliths, or ear stones, which you might have heard about because of their utility in determining the age of the fish. We'll come back to these organs in the lectures on sensory biology later on. So that's the neurocranium. Everything else in the fish's skull is going to be part of the Branchio Cranium, meaning the part that is formed primarily by the branchial arches, which is a fancy word for gill arches. So let me give you that word. The branchiocranium is sometimes also called the splanchnicranium, so let me give you that word. Splanchnicranium, meaning the suspended cranium. The origin of that word is a little obscure, but it comes from the Greek splanchna, meaning viscera. Just like your guts are suspended inside your body cavity, the remainder of the bones of the teleost skull are suspended off the back of the neurocranium by a large bone called the hyomandibula, which I'll draw here in purple. Hyomandibula. The origin and positioning of this bone forms a major part of an important evolutionary story that I'll tell you a few lectures from now. For right now, just recognize that the hyomandibula forms the dorsal part of a long arch of bone called the hyoid arch, the lower portion of which I'm adding here. So the lower portion is called the hyoid series, and this helps the fish to expand and contract the skull during suction feeding and respiration. Now, the hyoid arch sits posterior to another arch of bone called the Palatine Arch, which I'll draw here in green. Palatine Arch. The upper portion of the arch forms the roof of a fish's mouth, otherwise known as the palate, hence the name of the arch. There's a hinge between the upper and the lower portion of the arches, with the upper bone called the quadrate. That's really just this portion of it down here. That's a bone called the quadrate. And the lower portion here, a bone called the angulo-articular. The angulo-articular forms the posterior part of the fish's lower jaw, and thus the quadrate angulo-articular joint right there is the major joint that allows the fish to bite things. In some teleost fishes, the bones of the upper palatine arch also bear teeth, but not always. Now, there are several more bones in the oral jaws of a teleost, which I'm going to add here in orange. The anterior portion of the lower jaw is called the dentary, and this is the major tooth-bearing bone of the lower jaw. Let me add some teeth. Two tooth-bearing bones, called the premaxilla and the maxilla, form the upper jaw, with the premaxilla, unsurprisingly, placed anterior of the maxilla. Thus, the jaw of teleost fishes involves four major bones: premaxilla, maxilla, dentary, and angulo-articular, with the primary bite occurring between the premaxilla and the maxilla on the top and the dentary on the bottom. Okay, so our drawing is beginning to look a lot more like a fish head. Let's add the rest of the major components of the skull. Posterior to the hyoid series, which is in that purple or pink color, you'll find 5 more bony arches, which I'll draw here in yellow. So these are the branchial arches, or the gill arches, and their primary job is to provide structural support for the gills of the fish, which are the primary respiration organs. We'll see a little later in the course that many fishes have also modified the branchial arches to help them feed, either by forming a filter that catches plankton, or another set of jaws that helps grind and crush food in the back of the throat. Almost done. Next, I'm going to add a big plate of bone, which sits laterally to the gill arches. This is actually a composite of 4 bones, collectively called the operculum, and of which the biggest of the 4 is the opercle. As we'll see in the lecture on ventilation and respiration, the operculum forms one of 2 big valves in the fish's head that help it to pump water across the gills. It also helps to protect the delicate gills. Now lastly, I'm going to connect the hyoid series, here in purple, to a set of long bony plates called the branchiostegal rays. These form an accordion-like set of pleats on the posteroventral part of the fish's head, and helps to seal the valve created by the operculum as it opens and closes during ventilation. So there it is, a complete cartoon of a bony fish head. This is likely a lot to take in at once, and luckily, I've designed another exercise to help make sense of all this. In this week's material, you'll find a coloring exercise based on a salmon skull that will ask you to find various bones and color them according to the scheme that I've used here in this lightboard presentation. That should help you to identify the major functional units that we've discussed here, like the hyoid arch and the palatine arch, on an actual fish. You'll also find that I have maintained this color scheme throughout the set of lectures on skull anatomy and function. So, practicing your coloring here should help you follow along the next several presentations. For the purposes of studying this section, make sure that you learn the names and functions for the major units of bone that we've discussed today. You'll also want to know the names for a few of the specific bones within those units, as I've outlined on the coloring exercise that accompanies this section of the class. Any word that appears in bold in that exercise is a critical one to learn. That's all I have for today's Lightboard. I hope that you enjoyed viewing this presentation as much as I enjoyed drawing it. I'll see you next time, and until then, best fishes.